Hey, I'm Rylee. I'm a type 1 diabetic for 8 years and also co-founder of Diabetics with the last I being a 1.
I'm Jordan. I'm also the other co-founder of Diabetics, and I've had diabetes for 10 years now.
And I'm Jeff Yarger. And so today we're making a video looking at, so now you're a type 1 diabetic, or now you're a diabetic, and some of the tips you girls have for, newly diagnosed diabetics, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So looking at what I think I always think of starting as, didn't it take you girls both a while to get diagnosed with it? Before even becoming a diabetic, it was about figuring out that you were one. And so can you give me a little background to how you guys discovered that you were diabetic?
I'll start. We do have very different stories because she kind of had past experience from her sibling, but I am the only diabetic in my family and in past history as well. So we didn't really think that I had diabetes at first. And my first 2 weeks of kind of obtaining it, I guess, my parents just thought it might be the flu or some type of weird sickness going around.
You obtained diabetes? I like it.
Yeah, or my pancreas just said, I'm done. So, and so we kind of just sat in bed. I always had to drink water. I always had to pee. And my parents were just thinking it was a flu. And after about 2 weeks, they finally took me to the doctor. And the doctor again thought I didn't have diabetes. But then my mom started doing research herself because she was becoming a nurse at the time. And then she told the doctor herself, she's like, she has diabetes. And then after I got my blood sugar tested, it was about 900. So that was a clear sign that I had diabetes. But I was also 6 at the time, and I didn't really have an idea what it was. So my parents mostly handled the idea and kind of concept of it until I was about 8 when I really understood what it was.
Yeah, I had a sibling. My brother was diagnosed exactly 5 months before I was. So when I started getting thirsty and I felt a little off and sweaty and I had to use the bathroom a lot, I automatically thought, I might have diabetes. I told an aide at school one day during a field day where everyone was playing around and playing soccer and all these games. And eventually she told my parents. They'd tested me before, but I wasn't diabetic at that time, at least, because my blood sugar was normal. But then I tested, I'm pretty sure around 500, slightly high, but definitely not as high as some diabetics because we caught it a little bit early. And then I just went to the endocrinologist the next day they were open, and they're like, here you go, here's diabetes, take it home with you.
And yeah, I would say from a parent's perspective, especially if you're a parent who doesn't have a lot of history with diabetes, it can take a while to even diagnose it properly. And looking back on it, it's very obvious. The stomach problems, the constant thirsty and stuff, that these are all very indicative signs of having very high blood sugar, meaning, oftentimes your body isn't producing insulin properly. You're not managing carbohydrates or sugar in your system well. But if you haven't seen that before, these are just such common little ailments that, it can take quite a while to really figure it out, right? And so, but now, getting through the stage of, in a sense, figuring out that you have diabetes, that, you've come down with it and it's not just going to go away like the flu, right? Now's when it really gets to, and I would say almost everyone goes through a shock stage, right? I know parents do, and I know children do as well. And I would say a lot of times children's shock is even less than parents, just because they don't really understand initially, what they're getting into. And parents, I think, more quickly, come to the realization of what's going on in this. But what do you guys have to say as far as, acceptance of having diabetes?
I'd say that it takes a while to definitely accept the fact, oh my gosh, this is going to be a forever thing. There's not a cure. They don't even totally understand what it is besides an autoimmune disorder. So it's just overwhelming in the fact where you almost are ignorant to the fact that it's going to be such a long process. Because at first you're just in shock of what it is, and it's just kind of pushing it off in a way, but then you're forced to deal with it at that point, or you have to end up learning all this stuff and getting all this information all at once with doctors and your parents now obsessing over you in a way.
Yeah, I would say you had a little bit more, like you kind of realized it a lot earlier than me. And like I said earlier, I was 6 when I was diagnosed. So it was kind of my parents doing more of like the learning and knowing like what technology was present at the time. So it was more them, me. But as I did get older, I learned myself. But I would say in the very, very beginning, it was more my parents and not me.
Yeah. And I think, for parents, one of the hardest things is they get in shock and have a hard time accepting it themselves and almost internalize it themselves as oh my God, it's changing my whole life. And what I encourage parents to do that our endocrinologists forced on us really early, I thought was one of the best things, is to constantly remind us that this is not a disease that you have as parents. This is a disease that your children have. And that while you might be feeling sorry for yourself, that your life is changing, but it's really your kid's life that's changing a lot. And, the one I remember is, an endocrinologist saying, an anecdote that still shocks me to this day. He goes, I encourage parents to try to gain some empathy for what their kids do. So what I'm going to do is give you some saline solution, give you an extra blood glucose monitor, and every time you decide you want to eat anything, test your blood sugar and give yourself, in a sense, a shot of saline because it's not harmful at all. And just, in a sense, imitate at a real level what your kids go through for 1 week. They're going to do it more or less the rest of their lives. I'm asking you to do it for 1 week. FYI, less than 20% of parents make it a week. And that just almost shocked me that parents couldn't even make it 1 week what you guys deal with every week of your life, as far as acceptance. So I think parents really do have to work on, not just sympathizing with what you guys go through, but empathizing with it and trying to remember that these things are very long term, and we often get very kind of used to it and used to you guys handling it. So you were already mentioning point 2, and for me this was, I think, the one that we all spend so much time doing, which is realizing it's not really simple between what you guys are pointing out here, that there's a big difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetics, but both have to do with the hormone insulin, both have to do with blood sugar, with dietary things, how you intake carbohydrates, but there's just a lot in the learning process here. And it's usually going on simultaneously, right? I can tell you from, like you already mentioned, your parents were learning this initially. When kids are diagnosed at very young ages, it's often the parents that are forced to learn about it. Mm-hmm. But that soon steps into you guys learning about it, because ultimately, long term, you are managing your own diabetes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's kind of just all the points all in one. Like, you have to accept that it is lifelong and that you do have to deal with it, but mostly like learning like the technology that helps you is kind of what gives you like kind of a state of mind where like you can be okay with it because this technology helps you and makes your life easier. And it's not all just like shots. Like there's like insulin pumps that instead like of pricking yourself every time you eat, you can do it every 3 days. So stuff like that makes it seem not as like lifelong per se, but more like just involved.
Well, like you said, it's learning technology, because the technology is constantly changing diabetes.
Yeah.
Like you said, CG, continuous glucose monitors, pumps. We even just start using technology that average people without diabetes wouldn't even know. You said you went to the hospital, you're above 900. Most people wouldn't even know what that means.
Yeah.
That's a concentration of glucose or sugar in your blood that is extremely high. And in fact, I always joke, that's how you know a diabetic, right? Like you just say, what's your number? And, you'll say something, 200, and I'll be like, oh, that's a little high, or I'm 80. Oh, great. Like most people wouldn't even know what that means, don't know the units for it, don't understand what that even means. How much insulin are you dosing? What's your basal? What are you bolusing? I mean, we learn a whole new vocabulary, both in the technology side, but it goes so far beyond that, right? You basically need to become a dietitian to understand labels on food and how to do this. And we've talked about that in a separate video, but learning really is lifelong. And if I only have one thing to say about this, I probably overly emphasize this as an educator myself, but I feel like that's the one thing both kids and adults can do more, is not just rely on their healthcare provider, their endocrinologist, not just kids rely on their parents to understand the dietary side, the technology side, the research. The beautiful thing about the internet today is, the knowledge is out there freely available for you guys all to learn this stuff in all different aspects of it. And this is really, becomes a personal, lifelong pursuit. I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to best understand your own disease. And it goes beyond just, reading a few, things on the internet, et cetera. Really, there's so much research going on in diabetes. And most of that now is publicly accessible for people. The National Institute of Health makes sure that all publications, all research done by that are funded by them, that those articles that researchers produce are freely available. And so you can really learn a lot firsthand from the research going on, in these topics. So the next one you guys have is deal. So I'm curious to see what you girls have to say about this one on your checklist of dealing with being a type 1 diabetic. So
I'd just say you gotta end up dealing with it. You have to create habits of testing before you eat, or testing every 2 hours if you actually do what's recommended. Whether you do that or not is wavy, I guess. It's a little maybe, but you have to create a new lifestyle. Like, people are gonna ask you questions now, and you gotta be able to handle that too. Like, some people get annoyed, some people think of it as an opportunity. I try and think of it as an opportunity to tell someone about type 1 diabetes, since it's less common than type 2 diabetes, and I think it's good to differentiate between the two.
But just like with learning, where, like you said, you can learn the technology, you can learn about blood glucose and diet, what are carbohydrates and how do you calculate them? How do you figure out how much insulin you need how do they break down? I mean, there's so many aspects to it to learn. Dealing is kind of the same thing, right? It's not just dealing with peers coming up to you saying, because they don't know what diabetes is, right? And trying to be understanding, but it's dealing with your parents right? It's dealing with your friends. It's dealing with once you realize that insulin's a hormone, and going high and low has huge both mental, emotional, effects like any hormone would, health effects, etc. Dealing with your own health issues, your own mood swings, your own changes, and dealing with how you deal with highs and lows and stuff like that, right? It's really not just dealing internally, but also externally with parents, externally with friends and family, right? There's a lot of different things to deal with, in a sense, right? And I think that gets to the next one. So, lifelong.
That's the hardest thing. It's hard for me to realize that it's a lifelong thing, and everything I do is gonna affect me in the future. And I think it's scary to think about that if your blood sugars go high too long, you should lose eyesight. Like, all these bad things could happen. And as a diabetic, you are constantly reminded of that. Like, parents say that as a way to scare you. Health people say that as a way to scare you. But it's also nice to hear. I heard one story at Camp ASDA, which is funded by the ADA, and they told one story of a guy who's 90 and has no health issues, and he's a type 1 diabetic. And it's nice to hear that every once in a while, that if you treat yourself well and you deal with it now in a good manner, I guess, that it can turn out well. And I guess it's just taking that into consideration and really maturing in a way and becoming stronger, whether you're a child or a teen or diagnosed later if that actually happens. I haven't heard of any diagnosed that late, but it's really stepping up to the plate in a way.
And what you're saying to kind of parents and health care is that oftentimes, we all default to the same thing, right? Scare technique, the scare technique. If you don't do this, look at all these bad things that can happen. And while it's not that some of those things aren't true, it's that there needs to be a balance, right? Because you are going to have to deal with this a long time. And so, Jordan, you're not alone in this. So what do you mean by that?
So we basically mean there are other type 1 diabetics, not just us two, don't worry. So there's many programs and camps and stuff like that offer usually to younger type 1 diabetics so they can meet other people like them. For example, we go to a camp called Camp ASDA, like she said, supported by the ADA. And we go there for a week and we basically just hang out with almost 200, 300 type 1 diabetics our age for an entire week. And we just do activities. We all, I would say the most important part is that it's almost like a community. It seems normal at the time because every single meal, everyone is testing, everyone is bolusing, everyone's doing the same thing. And you kind of feel normal in that area. And then you kind of come out of it and you can connect the internet, like he said. It's great because you can talk to these people. If you're low or something like that in the middle of the night, most likely 9 times out of 10, someone else is low in the same exact position as you. And it's kind of eye-opening to see that you're not alone in this, I don't want to say fight, but this disease is struggling, but there are other people that struggle with you. So you always have that support on your back. And we always support each other too.
Yeah, and then we have our website, which we'd love to have people come on our website and email us their stories and comment on our blogs or on our videos telling us how they deal with things or what they feel like when they're low, because our journey is to somehow create a community on the internet as well, and that's what our goal is through our website, is to really take our experiences and hopefully relate to others and create something where no one feels alone.
Right. And I think this goes to oftentimes parents feel like they can be there, healthcare people feel like they can be there, but I think what you're also expressing is there's a big difference between someone who understands it and someone who lives it. And having other people that live it, makes a big difference, right? And with the rise of social media and everything else, it's really a good time to bring, communities together that can empathize and that go through the same things. So I agree. So with that, I think we've covered some of these basic tips, and hopefully this helps for any new diabetics or new parents that are dealing with children going through diabetes themselves.
Yeah, thank you for your perspective, and I hope our perspectives help as well. And check us out at diabetics.org with the last I being a 1.
Thank you.
Thanks.